It's my great pleasure today to introduce this year's Payton Lecture speaker. The Payton Lecture is one of the Society's prize lectures and is awarded each year to a speaker who talks on an historical aspect of physiological research. The lecture is published each year in Experimental Physiology, and it's our great pleasure this year to have Dr. John West giving the lecture. He hardly needs any introduction. I think many of us, certainly as I did, will have first come to know him because of his marvellous textbook on respiratory physiology, which so many undergraduate courses throughout the world use. I think now it's been translated into 10 or 11 different languages, including Chinese and Malay and a number of others. So it is truly a globally appreciated text. But Dr. West began his career as a medical student in the University of Adelaide, and after completing his studies there, and I think 1 year of house officer, moved to London, where he spent about the next 15 years in the Royal Postgraduate Medical School at Hammersmith. And it was there that he began his seminal work on distribution of, or inhomogeneities of distribution of ventilation and perfusion in the lung, and the consequences of that physiologically. And at the end of his time in London, he spent a year's sabbatical in NASA with the Space Agency, and there developed an interest at the other extreme, that is, no gravity and its effects on lungs, and has continued until recently work developing the effects of gravity on lung function. He's a long-standing interest in the history of medicine, including having written monographs of that, in particular a book on high altitude, the history and physiology of high-altitude medicine. And therefore, he's a very appropriate lecturer to have here today. He's very distinguished in many fields. He has hundreds of publications. He asked me to be brief, so I won't go through all of those in details, many awards and honours. And so it's our great pleasure to ask Dr. West to come up and give this year's Payton Lecture. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and particularly in this magnificent building. They don't build them like this anymore, you know, so have a good look round. It's a wonderful building. And I'm very grateful to the organisers for inviting me to give this Payton Lecture. So a word or two, first of all, about Sir William Payton. If this will work. Am I pressing in the wrong place? Oh, there we go. Now I've gone too far. Back one, there we are. So Sir William Payton, or Bill Payton, as he was commonly called, was a pharmacologist here in Oxford. Just a few words about him. Professor of pharmacology, worked extensively on drug therapy of hypertension. He also worked on the pathophysiology of decompression sickness and pharmacology of smooth muscle relaxants. So he was an important pharmacologist in his own right. However, he had a strong interest in the history of medicine, and in fact became a trustee of the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is a very august institution in London, and of course has many professional historians in it. A little byway here is that one of the obituaries of Payton, written by Bill Mynham, points out that Payton was a member of 72 committees by his own admission. And I always think that that's beyond the normal call of duty. So what I'm going to do is talk about the 100th anniversary of the Anglo-American Pikes Peak expedition. It took place in 1911. And it's an opportunity to go back and look at the state of physiology 100 years ago, and also what led up to the expedition in 1911. I think it's quite useful to do that. Now, all the grey hairs in the front probably don't need to be reminded of the history, but there are a lot of young people these days who really don't know much about the history. In fact, I'm sorry to say, don't care too much about the history. But it's very interesting, it's important, and this is an opportunity to talk briefly about it. Now, I'd like to start with a man called Paul Bert, a French physiologist who is often called the father of high-altitude physiology, or indeed the father of environmental physiology, because in addition to the work that he did at high altitude, he also worked on diving, the effects of high pressure. And in 1878, Paul Bert published La Pression Barométrique, shown here. I was Googling this morning, and to my surprise, I find that Google has actually digitized it, and you can read it on your laptop now. Very remarkable. I was Googling it because I was looking for the English translation. There's a very good English translation done of it, and so if your French is a bit rusty, that's the place to go. It's a wonderful book to read, particularly the first chapter on the history of high-altitude physiology is extremely well done. And Paul Bert was a very urbane, he got a wonderful wit, and it's wonderful to read. Now, prior to Paul Bert, there were all sorts of strange ideas about what happened at high altitude. People were aware of the fact that that high altitude had deleterious effects on the body, but all sorts of bizarre theories, and this is just one of them I'm putting here. One theory was that it weakened the joint between the femur and the pelvis because of the low air pressure. As a result, the hip muscles worked harder, causing fatigue. And of course, that's nonsense, but that was one of the theories that thing. But Paul Bert was able to show that the important feature was the low partial pressure of oxygen. And he did that using this simple but very elegant equipment. What he showed was that if you had an animal in the chamber here, you could either provide it with gases of various oxygen concentrations using a bag here. You could reduce the oxygen concentration in the air, and that's called normobaric hypoxia. Or you could provide the animal with air, but you could reduce the barometric pressure in the chamber by attaching an air pump here and measuring the pressure with the mercury manometer, as you can see. Very simple piece of equipment, very effective, and Bert showed quite convincingly that the important thing was the PO2. Not everybody accepted that initially, but that was he definitely showed that clearly. His work was done in the Sorbonne in Paris using enormous pressure chambers, big pumps, pressure pumps, and here's an example of one of his pressure chambers here. In fact, Bert exposed himself to the pressure on the summit of Mount Everest, breathing supplementary oxygen, of course, but was able to show that he was able to survive if he breathed supplementary oxygen at that extremely low pressure. Now, Paul Bert never went to high altitude, but it's very shortly after his work in the Sorbonne, it became clear that really, rather than generate the low pressure yourself, you might as well go to high altitude where the low pressure was existing. And this man, Joseph Vallot, Frenchman also, put up the first high-altitude laboratory on Mont Blanc at an altitude of about 4,350 meters, quite high, below the summit, but not very far below the summit. And this was in 1890, just 12 years after the publication of La Pression Barométrique. And a number of experiments were done there. Actually, Vallot was not a physiologist. He was a botanist and a geologist, but a number of physiologists worked in this. And actually, one of the interesting features, and I don't have time to go into it, is there was a physician, Yacotet, who worked in the laboratory here and died of what we now believe was high-altitude pulmonary edema. So it was seen to be a somewhat hazardous thing to go to this hut. Now, shortly after that, first I must show, this is to make the point that getting to the Observatoire Vallot was difficult. And I like this slide because this is Professor Jensen en route to the Grand Mullet, and it suggests a pattern for older physiologists like myself who can count on the support of their graduate students. So here's Angelo Mosso, Italian physiologist in Turin, a very important man, and he was responsible in part for developing another laboratory almost immediately after the Observatoire Vallot on the Monte Rosa. the Punta Gavetti on the Monte Rosa. And here you can see the construction of the Capanna Margherita, as it was called. It was called Margherita because the Queen of Italy, a Savoy queen called Margherita, was an alpinist and very interested in high altitude climbing and problems at high altitude. And there's a rather nice photograph here of Queen Margherita on her way up to the Capanna Margherita here, accompanied by a couple of attendants and 2 dogs. And she actually spent a night at the Capanna Margherita, which is no small thing to do because it's very high at 4,559 meters, and it's quite difficult to spend the night there. Here is another photograph taken a little bit later when it had been completed, and here is a photograph of the Capanna Margherita today, and you can get a feel for the difficulty in getting there. It's a bit of a slog up the glacier, as you can see, and it's quite high at 4,559 meters. One of the interesting things about the Capanna Margherita and the Observatoire below is that they're still in use. And in fact, the Capanna Margherita is extensively used. And I'm sure there's a group up there right now working away, extensively used by people from Italy and Switzerland particularly. It's right on the border between Italy and Switzerland, and a lot of people do a lot of very, very good work there, because if you take people up, they usually spend 1 night en route, but if they're taken straight up to the Capanna Margherita, there's a high instance of acute mountain sickness because it is so high. Now, here's a man called Natanz. He was a German physiologist. He was actually an animal physiologist in Berlin, and he was also very interested in high altitude. Wrote a very important book, Bergwanderungen, etc. I won't give you the full title, quite a long title, but with lots and lots of interesting data. And Zuntz actually organized an expedition to Tenerife in the Canary Islands, the Alta Vista hut at 3,350 meters there. And that was an expedition which was quite important. A lot of physiology was done and included a number of people, including Joseph Barcroft from Cambridge and C.G. Douglas from Oxford were on that expedition. So that was a situation in 1910 when Haldane decided to mount another expedition to high altitude. And let's have a few words, first of all, about John Scott Haldane. J.S. Haldane as he's known. Here's a little bit of biographical information about him. He was a Scot, came from a distinguished Scots family, trained in Edinburgh, both schooling and university, and interestingly, his first interest was philosophy. And the first article he wrote in the journal Mind, which I think is still going strong, was on philosophy. But he graduated from there, went to Dundee, and did some work on the slums of Dundee, and was able to measure high concentrations of carbon dioxide in some of the slums. In 1887, he came to Oxford, and there was a very important paper that anybody here who's interested in the control of ventilation will certainly be aware of, a paper by Douglas and Haldane in 1905 demonstrating, showing the great importance of CO2 in the normal control of ventilation, a very critically important paper. However, Haldane had extensive interests, particularly in industrial settings. And here's a photograph of him in a mine. He did a lot of work in mines, and actually the people in the mining area, and industrial medicine generally, know a great deal about Haldane because he was such an important person. So let's talk about the origin of the Pikes Peak expedition. Haldane met Yandell Henderson, who was a physiologist from Yale University, at the International Congress of Physiology in Vienna in 1910. And of course, the next International Physiology Congress, I don't need to remind you, is in Birmingham in 2013. And Haldane said, what we need is a nice, comfortable mountain. Now, that sounds a bit whimsical, doesn't it, initially? But the reasons were as follows, as you'll see. He thought that the Capella Margherita had severe disadvantages. And I'm going to read a little bit of this. It's rather amusing. He said to reach it, one must climb several thousand feet over snow and ice. The climate is Arctic, even in midsummer. And worst of all, the investigator must cook for himself. It's open to question whether the effects observed are due to the low barometric pressure or the bad cooking. Joseph Barcroft had also been to the Capella Margherita, and he said the difficulties of transport greatly restrict the possibilities both of research and gastronomy. And one has the uncomfortable feeling that maybe the British physiologists don't have the right stuff. But he was making, of course, a very important point. What he was saying is that what you really want, if you're going to study the effects of the hypoxia of high altitude, is an environment where the only difference is the low oxygen. And you don't want the cold and the difficulties of cooking and all the rest of it to interfere with that. And so actually Pikes Peak had a number of very important advantages. There was easy access via a cog railway, quite high at 4,300 meters. And incidentally, those of you perhaps who are not familiar with this part of the world, is that Pikes Peak is just by Colorado Springs, which is, 100 miles south of Denver, something like that. And it's the mountain that you first see as you're crossing the plains going west. In fact, the early people who were going west, they had a saying, Pikes Peak or bust, because that was once you got to Pikes Peak, it meant that you'd made your way to the Colorado Rockies. Its altitude was indicated as quite high, 4,300 meters, a little over 14,000 feet. There was a hotel on top with 4 rooms that could be set aside for the expedition. The laboratory was warm, so there was no problem with cold. And according to Hal Dein, the cuisine was excellent. So it had many advantages over the Capella Margherita or the Observatoire Valot, both of which had very difficult access and still do. Occasionally you can take a helicopter to either of those, but actually there was an accident with the helicopter. Very difficult to land a helicopter on the space where the Capella Margherita is, and there was a helicopter accident where Peter Birch, very important physiologist, had some problems as a result. So those high altitude stations are very difficult of access, and Pikes Peak had big advantages. Now, the timing of the expedition is shown here. After making some preliminary observations in the Biological Laboratory of Colorado College, there's a man called Schneider there, as we can see, we proceeded to the summit by cogwheel railway on July the 12th. Hold it. July the 12th. That's today. So the organizers arranged this talk on the very day, 100 years ago, of the ascent of Pikes Peak. Very well done. So here are the 5 people on the summit. And from left to right, we have J.S. Haldane, somebody called Mabel Fitzgerald, who I'll talk more about towards the end, E.C. Schneider, who was actually from Colorado College, right at the bottom of Pikes Peak, but previously had been at Yale and therefore knew Henderson. Then we have Henderson, and finally Douglas on the right. Douglas was considerably younger than Haldane. So those were the 5 people, and as you'll hear later, the 4 men went to the summit and did all the work, whereas Mabel Fitzgerald, for reasons that aren't absolutely clear, did not accompany the men on the summit. It's alleged that was because she wasn't chaperoned, although we think that's pretty unlikely. It's probably that it just would have complicated the living conditions on the summit. Here's the old Pikes Peak Railway. Isn't this a wonderful slide? I'm not absolutely certain of the date of this, but it's pretty old, and presumably it was something like that took the participants up to Pikes Peak. Here's the modern Pikes Peak Railway, which of course is much more elegant, as you can see. And in fact, recently a group from Oxford went up to Pikes Peak and did some measurements there, and they took that train. Now here's the lab on the summit. It's not a good photograph, I'm afraid, but what it does show is the heater at the back, pot-bellied heater there, and it shows the equipment. For example, you can see a Douglas bag here that C.G. Douglas invented, and other pieces of equipment. And in fact, we have some bits of equipment here, which I'll mention later on, and you may be able to recognize those, I don't know. Somebody said that they could see a slide rule in this photograph. I'm not sure where it is. Possibly it's somewhere there. And we have a slide rule here, which I believe, we believe was on the Pikes Peak expedition. Here's a nice photograph of 3 of the participants climbing up the cogwheel railway track. This, I believe, is Douglas with his bag here, and this is Schneider with his peculiar hat, and Haldane behind, I think with a stopwatch probably. And they made measurements of exercise physiology. And here are the main projects of the expedition. First of all, they were particularly interested in the features of acute mountain sickness, because with the cogwheel railway, people came up, of course, very rapidly. They often came up in the morning to see the sunrise. That was one of the things that was nice to do. And of course, in, I don't know, an hour or two, you could ascend from Colorado Springs, which is relatively low, to 4,300 meters, which is pretty high, and a lot of people developed acute mountain sickness. Also, some people walked up, some people took a donkey up, and they described the scene as like a cross-channel crossing with various people vomiting all over the place. So there was a lot of acute mountain sickness, headache, malaise, vomiting, and so on. Next, they did a lot of measurements of the alveolar and arterial partial pressures of oxygen during acclimatization. They were particularly interested in the mechanism of acclimatization, and I'll show you some of those data in a moment. They also made a lot of measurements of ventilation. They were, of course, very aware of the hyperventilation at high altitude, and they studied that at length. Did a number of measurements on periodic breathing. Now, actually, that had been observed before, both at the Observatoire Velo and the Capana Margherita, but they made additional measurements. They were able, for example, to look at the effects of oxygen administration on periodic breathing, and I'll show you some of those data. They made measurements during exercise of respiratory gas exchange. They were particularly interested, for some reason, in the what we call the respiratory exchange ratio, or the respiratory quotient. I'm not quite sure why they had such an interest in that, but what they showed was what we know today, and that is that at rest it's of the order of 0.8, 0.85, and it goes up to 1 or even above 1 on exercise on non-steady state. They made estimates of cardiac output. I say estimates because they weren't really able to make accurate measurements. They used things like pulse pressure, for example, and heart rate, and they had a very crude form of a ballistic cardiograph. They came to the conclusion that cardiac output was unchanged in acclimatized subjects, and that's what we believe today, which incidentally always surprises me, but that's the case. And then finally, they did extensive measurements on the blood hemoglobin concentration. We have the hemoglobinometer here that they used, and the oxygen capacity and blood volume. And as I say, they were particularly interested in the mechanisms of the acclimatization process. Now, they made measurements of both the alveolar and the arterial PO2. Alveolar was not a problem. Of course, Haldane had developed the Haldane apparatus for measuring the PO2 and the PCO2 in gas samples, and still used today. But the arterial PO2, they had a problem with. And I don't quite know why they did this. There had been an aerotonometer, as it's called, developed by both Christian Bohr and August Krogh in Copenhagen. That was a device where you equilibrated a small amount of air with blood, and then you measured the PO2 of the air. And, you know, that's a nice direct way of doing it. But Haldane, for reasons that are not absolutely clear, had a much more indirect way of measuring the arterial PO2. He actually had people inhale carbon monoxide, and he looked at the ratio of the carboxyhemoglobin to the oxyhemoglobin, and he calculated the partial pressure of oxygen from that. Well, unfortunately, he got the wrong answer. I think the reason probably why he developed that technique was he'd done a lot of work on carbon monoxide in the mines, so he was very familiar with the problems of carbon monoxide poisoning. At any event, that was one of the problems with the expedition. They reported that the arterial value of PO2 was on the average 36 millimeters of mercury higher than the alveolar value, which of course is incorrect, and that was an unfortunate error. It shouldn't, though, blind us to the fact that they made a lot of other measurements that were extremely valuable and useful. Now here shows some of the alveolar gases during acclimatization, and in their paper they show all the subjects. It's quite a complicated slide, and here I've just taken the data for Douglas, and as you can see, the heavy line shows the PCO2, which starts off, the axis is here, starts off at 40, and then on going to high altitude, first of all, it falls a little bit at Colorado Springs, and then when they get to Pikes Peak, it falls dramatically. Incidentally, they spent 5 weeks on the summit on Pikes Peak, and the expedition was very nicely planned. In other words, they had a period at sea level prior to going to high altitude, then a long period, 5 weeks at high altitude, and then another 3 weeks at sea level again. So that was a classical design of an expedition, and it's influenced many, many expeditions since then. So here's the PCO2 falling during the 5 weeks at high altitude. It looks as though it's continuing to fall perhaps over the whole of the 5 weeks, and it goes down to a value of about 25, 26 millimeters of mercury, something like that. And then you'll notice that when they returned first to Colorado Springs for 2 or 3 days, and then finally to New Haven, they all went to New Haven where Yale is, and the PCO2 comes back to normal. But you'll notice that the PCO2 takes most of 3 weeks or so to return to normal. Those are very important data because relatively few measurements have been made of the de-acclimatization process. And I don't know that there are any measurements, as a matter of fact, I'm not aware of them, that are as convincing as the measurements made 100 years ago on this expedition. The PO2, of course, fell over, this is the axis here. The PO2 was about 100 at sea level, fell dramatically down to about, here we are, so this smaller line here, to 50 millimeters of mercury. So it was halved when they went to Pikes Peak. So it's not surprising that people develop acute mountain sickness. I mean, the alveolar PO2 is just half the normal value. It rose somewhat as the PCO2 fell, of course, ventilation increased, and then on return to New Haven, it returned to the value. But it took quite a bit of time to return to its value, normal value of 100. So those were important pieces of information, and of course they recognized that the cause of the reduction in CO2 was hyperventilation. But it's interesting that, of course, they didn't know what the mechanism of the hyperventilation was. And if you read the article, which is, by the way, the article, I should say, is easily accessible on JSTOR. It's 133 pages long, so you want to set aside a few hours to go through it. It's not like a modern paper. It's a rather leisured style, but it's good reading. But they spend quite a bit of time in this tortured discussion of what could be causing the hyperventilation. One theory was that the lactic acid caused by the hypoxia stimulated the respiratory center. And I suppose they had this idea because CO2 also being acid, they knew that stimulated the respiratory center, and they thought that maybe lactic acid could do that. And then they also talked about resetting the exciting threshold for CO2. But of course what they didn't know was about the peripheral chemoreceptors, because they were only described 15 years later by the two Haymans. And so they were at a disadvantage there. So they certainly were able to describe the effects of hyperventilation, but the mechanism eluded them. Here are the measurements of periodic breathing. Two subjects. I think the top one is Haldane, and you can see the periodic breathing here. At the top line is simply a timing thing. This is a chymograph, of course, this smoke drum, good old smoke drum. And you can see the periodic breathing here clearly with the periods of hyperventilation and then period of apnea. And then oxygen was given here, and the periodic breathing went away, and the oxygen was taken off here, and the periodic breathing returns. Same thing is seen in the bottom slide, which is from Douglas. Now, it's interesting that Douglas, in order to generate the periodic breathing, had quite a long period of hyperventilation. And as a result of that, he developed periodic breathing, very striking, as you can see, with hyperventilation here and a long apneic period. And then oxygen was given here. Again, the periodic breathing went away. And then oxygen was taken off here. Nothing much happened for a bit, but then eventually the periodic breathing returned. And that was perhaps the first clear demonstration that it was oxygen that was very important in the mechanism of periodic breathing. Periodic breathing probably has to do with the fact that the drive from oxygen, the hypoxia via the chemoreceptors, is so very strong at high altitude, and therefore the feedback system becomes unstable. And it's interesting, by the way, that Sherpas who are born at high altitude and tend to have a reduced ventilatory response to hypoxia often show no periodic breathing at all. Here are some of the measurements they made on the blood, and again, it's a little bit complicated here. The solid line is actually the oxygen capacity of the blood, and the dotted line here at the bottom, I can't quite see it, the dotted line here at the bottom is actually the blood volume. And the thinner line here is the hemoglobin concentration. So what they showed was that both the oxygen capacity and the hemoglobin concentration increased, but that the hemoglobin concentration increased almost immediately on going to high altitude. Now, of course, that is not because of erythropoiesis, of increased erythropoiesis. That's because of the reduction in blood volume. And that we often see that now when people immediately go to high altitude. In fact, we ask our medical students this question often: what happens if you see an increase in hemoglobin concentration within the first day or so of high altitude, what's the mechanism? And the answer is hemoconcentration, because it's too early for the response of the bone marrow. And they made extensive measurements of that, and you can see very high hemoglobin concentrations over the period of the 5 weeks there. So here's a summary of the main findings. As I said, acute mountain sickness was initially seen in all subjects, certainly the 4 men of the expedition. They all had acute mountain sickness. Douglas probably had the worst, as it happens, but most of the symptoms disappeared after the first 2 or 3 days, except, of course, for the hyperventilation, which was maintained. They were, as I said, in error with the fact that the arterial PO2 apparently was higher than the alveolar value, and of course that was an error. Over the 2 weeks, no, that's wrong. It's 5 weeks. That's a mistake on the slide. Over 5 weeks, the alveolar PCO2 fell to about 25 millimeters of mercury, and it took 2 or 3 weeks to return to normal. As I've shown, periodic breathing was common, abolished by oxygen breathing. They attempted to measure cardiac output. They thought it was unchanged. They were correct, but their measurements actually were rather crude. And they also showed that the respiratory exchange ratio at high altitude was the same as at sea level. And incidentally, they also showed that for a given work level, the oxygen consumption was the same at high altitude as it was at sea level. Hemoglobin concentration continued to increase for several weeks, and the initial rise was due to hemoconcentration. And they said the three main factors in the acclimatization process were oxygen secretion, hyperventilation, and increased hemoglobin. They were correct about the last two, but not the first. And I don't have time to go into this now, but Haldane was a bit of a vitalist. And this comes from his initial interest in philosophy, actually. He was a bit of a vitalist, and he believed that living animals did not just obey the laws of chemistry and physics, which is a little bit strange. But he actually, in the last edition of his book, Respiration, which he wrote with Priestley in 1935, a whole chapter is devoted to the evidence of oxygen secretion. And briefly, one of the reasons why he believed in oxygen secretion was he was aware of the fact that the swim bladder of the fish has a very high PO2, much higher than the PO2 in the surrounding water. So he said, well, if the swim bladder of the fish can do it, and the swim bladder of the fish is a diverticulum of the GI tract, as the lungs are, he said, if the fish can do it in the swim bladder, surely the mammal can do it in the lung. But unfortunately, as I say, he was incorrect there. Now let me, in the last few minutes, talk a little bit about Mabel Purefoy Fitzgerald, a very interesting character indeed. Here's a little bit of biographical information here. Born in Preston, Canterbury, in Hampshire. She actually spent some time at the university here doing some research with Haldane. But at that time, and she did quite a bit, she had several papers published under her own name or her first name. However, at that time, Oxford did not allow women to take physiology, and she couldn't obtain a degree. In 1907, she moved to the Rockefeller Institute in New York, and it was while she was there that she heard about the Pikes Peak expedition. She applied to join them, and they said, yes, come along. As I indicated before, for one reason or another, she was not able to join the men on the summit. So what happened? Well, Haldane suggested another project for her. He said, why don't you go down to the Colorado mining towns, which in the Pikes Peak area and around there, and make some measurements of alveolar gas concentrations, which she did, accompanied only by a mule. And, you know, it's difficult to imagine a more hazardous situation for a single woman than to study the miners in the Colorado mining camps in the early part of the 20th century. But that's what she did. And she actually extended those studies later in North Carolina. And her data are still used today. Now, this is the plot from her paper, her main paper. And down here, it shows the PCO2 plotted against the barometric pressure. And incidentally, her barometer is right here on the table in front. You can have a look at it. Don't take it away. And you can see that there was a decrease in the alveolar PCO2 as the altitude increased, in other words, as the barometric pressure fell. And she was very much aware of the difference between men and women, that women had a higher ventilation than men, because of the progesterone, and so here are the differences here. The PCO2 was lower in the women. Now, she also plotted the alveolar PO2, which perhaps was a little bit naughty because she didn't actually measure that. She actually inferred that, calculated that from the respiratory exchange ratio, which she assumed to be 0.83. And so those are the calculated data here, and they show, of course, a fall in PO2 as you go to increasing altitude. And the interesting thing about these data is that they're still being used. In fact, here are some data that we obtained on our Everest expedition some years ago, and they show the PO2 and the PCO2. This PCO2 on the vertical axis, PO2 on the horizontal axis, this so-called oxygen carbon dioxide diagram. And you can see that the values at sea level here, PO2 about 100, PCO2 of 40. Here we are on the summit of Mount Everest, where the PCO2 is around about 7 or 8 millimeters of mercury, extraordinarily low. But the interesting thing from our point of view here is those data points are from Mabel Fitzgerald. nobody else has bothered to make measurements at these relatively low altitudes. So her data are still shown today. Now, here's an interesting thing. Tom Smith, who's in the physiology department here, and I were talking about this. I met him a few months ago. And it turns out that Mabel Fitzgerald and her sisters, she had 5 sisters altogether, in 1896, they moved to Oxford and to 12 Crick Road, which is just a little bit north of where we are right here. And the house is still exactly the same as when she moved there. And here's a strange coincidence, that 11 Crick Road, which is just to the left, that's that one there, and is shown on the slide here, 11 Crick Road, is where Haldane lived. They were neighbours. And actually, here's the blue plaque, the Oxford blue plaque, on 11 Crick Road for Haldane. But oddly enough, they appear not to have met each other at that time. They were both there for about 5 years, and then Haldane moved elsewhere in Oxford. But they did not meet apparently at that time, according to the correspondence. But of course, later on, she worked with Haldane. Now, I want to say just a few words in closing about the Haldane Centenary Symposium, which was exactly 50 years ago, right? And this was a symposium put together by Dan Cunningham and Brian Lloyd, whom I'm sure some of you knew. And what happened at the symposium is, well, first of all, let me show you. What happened was that they all wondered what had occurred with Mabel Fitzgerald. She'd dropped off the radar screen. She'd done all this work back in the 1911, a little bit later on, but they'd lost track of her. And Dan Cunningham was looking in the Oxford telephone directory, and there she was. And so he telephoned her, and she came along to the symposium. And here she is, Mabel Fitzgerald, in her 90s here. This is C.G. Douglas here, and this is J.B.S. Haldane, the son of J.S. Haldane. You know, many biologists know the name J.B.S. Haldane much better than J.S. Haldane because J.B.S. was such a prominent evolutionary biologist. So many biologists, if I mention the word Haldane, they think I'm talking about J.B.S. So that's a fantastic photograph. And here's a picture, and I'm just going to show this rather nostalgic, of the symposium back in 1961. And I wonder how many people are here. You don't have to put your hand up, but I wonder how many people here were at the symposium back in 1961. I was very fortunate to be there myself, actually. But there are all sorts of faces here. I don't have time to go through them. Actually, Douglas is here, and next to him is Haymans. I guess the younger Haymans it must have been. But those of you who know these people will be able to recognize Broughton here, for example, and the 2 de Burgh Dailies here, and this is Cournand, and lots of people that I'm sure the older people can recognize here. So that was an important symposium. Now, because Mabel Fitzgerald had surfaced at this symposium in 1961, people apparently became rather embarrassed that she'd done all this work and never been given a degree by Oxford University. So at the age of 100, she was given an honorary MA, and here she is doing that. So that was rather nice. Now this is just a reminder to tell me, come up afterwards if you're interested and look at some of the artifacts of the Pikes Peak expedition. They're still in the physiology department, or whatever it's called these days. Still in the physiology department. I wonder if that's right, but they are there, and they're being kept carefully. And there are a number of things here, including the aneroid barometer, the slide rules, some very nice photographs, and so on. And finally, just let me mention the Fitzgerald Archive. Now, the Bodleian Library here has a fantastic archive on Mabel Fitzgerald. There are something like 40 enormous hat boxes full of material. She never threw anything away. All her letters, reports, data. I was looking through them this morning, actually. Pages and pages of long division that she used. Amazing. And the archive is here, and it's a treasure trove for anybody who would be interested in doing some work on Mabel Fitzgerald. Completely uncatalogued. Nobody has ever had the time to go through it. The only person who's looked at it carefully was Bob Torrance, who looked at some of the material and wrote a nice article about Mabel Fitzgerald, but it's all here in the Bodleian. I wrote to the Bodleian before, when I was coming to this meeting, and I said, can I have a look at the archive? They said, yes. And a nice letter came back. They said, by all means, come back in 2015. I thought, that's very Oxford, you know. I mean, the Bodleian's been there for, 700 or 800 years, whatever it is. So what's 4 or 5 years to the Bodleian Library? But in fact, they relented, and they brought the material back, and I've been having a look at it. So that's a wonderful thing, the Fitzgerald Archive. So very much, in summary, the Pikes Peak expedition, a landmark in high-altitude physiology. The design of the expedition has influenced so many expeditions since then. Most of the findings have stood the test of time, with the only exception being the emphasis on oxygen secretion. The description of the physiology of acclimatization was classical. It's in all the textbooks. Of course, they didn't know what was responsible for the hyperventilation. That had to wait for the Haymans when they came along 15 years later. And finally, Mabel Fitzgerald studies. Oops, there's an error there. The Fitzgerald should have a capital G. Were done under very difficult conditions, but the results are still cited today. So thank you very much for your attention.